All right, everyone, quiet it down. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 4 of the Combating Homelessness Track. I'm Cindy Stotler from the Arizona Department of Housing, and I'll be moderating this session titled Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project. Every year, thousands of children throughout Arizona find themselves displaced and unaccompanied. Homeless youth are 4 times more likely to drop out of school, and students who don't earn a high school diploma are much more likely to experience poverty, chronic homelessness, unemployment, poor health, reliance on social services, and potential incarceration. But young people are very adaptable, and they can overcome all kinds of setbacks if we can reach them with the right intervention. The Tucson Pima Collaboration to End Homelessness is a regional partnership of 8 local agencies doing amazing work to combat youth homelessness. Speakers from this collaboration include Austin Puka, Community Services Project Coordinator in the Housing and Community Development Department at the City of Tucson, Victoria Teller-Cash, Youth Engagement Specialist for Youth on Their Own, and Shannon Fowler, Assistant Social Science Researcher at the University of Arizona's Southwest Institute for Research on Women. This session again is both live and virtual, so we'll ask everyone to allow, I think it's one presentation, so we'll have all 3 speakers speak, and then we'll open up for questions at the end. And I'll ask our virtual attendees to please enter any questions in the chat room, and we'll ask them for you. And now let's please welcome our first speaker, Austin Puka.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let's see here. I'm Austin Puka, she, hers, from the City of Tucson. Oh, yeah. I'm Austin Puka, she, hers. Thank you for the introduction, Cindy. I'm going to keep it going since Cindy introduced us already. All right, so a little bit of background about the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project. In 2016, Housing and Urban Development released this project for communities to collaborate and center youth as leaders and equal decision makers to develop and implement a coordinated approach to solving homelessness in their communities. So it was a pretty intense application process, and that it involved really bringing cross-sector stakeholders to the table and creating a coordinated community plan. And we'll talk about how we developed that. And it was reviewed on these 5 criteria, right? The leadership capacity that your community could develop for young people. What does that community need? What data do you have actually that supports that that's a community need? The capacity to evaluate that data ongoing, and then really centers how the community collaborates. And we kind of talk about it as partnership now. We'll talk about that later. So more specifically, the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project uses the core outcomes from the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. And as I have a previous history as being a direct service provider, and something that really stood out to me in these core outcomes is that they're really just a trauma-informed approach of the 5 domains of well-being. So you see there, you have stable housing, and that directly relates to stability and safety, permanent connections, and that directly relates to social connectedness, education and employment, that folks might just really consider mastery, having something that you are a master of and can help and lead and teach other folks. And then health and well-being. And from a trauma-informed approach, that is, right, meaningful access to relevant resources. And something that I think really stands out in those differences is from these 4 core outcomes, I think what is missing there is that meaningful portion. And that's where YHDP asks you to call in young people, right? We can't be making solutions for folks from a trauma-informed approach and center them if they're not there. So in 2017, TPCH established a formal youth action committee, and that's it's a committee of lived and living experience of young people in our community that are either have experienced housing instability and houselessness or are currently. And between that Youth Action Committee and our lovely partners in planning, Youth on Their Own and Zero, in 2018, our family services contracted with Groy McGilligan to do a homeless youth needs assessment. And Org Code came and did a youth gaps analysis for us to give us real data about what was missing in our system. And with that information from young folks there being partners and co-conspirators in developing our plan, what can we bring then to fill those gaps? So our coordinated community plan to prevent and end youth homelessness was approved by HUD in April, right, of 2020. And so our community received roughly $4.6 million to launch these programs. So like in depth, what does that really mean? What did that analysis show us? And there's specific information on the table in the back, but what our needs assessment really showed us is that our young people those core outcomes that they need to resolve homelessness and to have permanent stability. There's just huge gaps, and they rely heavily on services that they don't know are even out there. So if you see there, 67% of young folks, where it says they're utilizing subsidized, that's utilizing subsidized transportation in our community. And when we think about Pima County as 9,000 square feet, we have desert resources and our transportation doesn't go everywhere. And we want to engage folks in employment and education. How will they get there? So with all of those information and the data, and with young folks leading, right, participate in extensive technical assistance. And I think it's important to rely on that technical assistance and use it to understand what we're applying for. I think that was the greatest lesson for our community. We were not awarded YHDP our first 2 applications. And I think that speaks to our community intensifying that partnership with young people. So target universalism is taking a data and in coordination with partnership to develop targeted processes, right, to achieve a universal goal. So our universal goal are these core outcomes, but that targeted process can't be targeted without young folks at the table telling us what they need. And so in that, right, for our system modeling, where we decided what projects do we fund, young people were there. They said to us, this is what we need. And an adult partner said, well, this is what that really means. And in the housing environment, they were able to ask meaningful questions, and they were participatory in all of our technical assistance. It wasn't a separate experience. You really got to be co-conspirators with the folks that you're trying to serve. This doesn't just apply to young people, right? In our request for proposal process, they were there at every portion in designing the timeline, in designing what do you want to receive from applicants? What do we want to see in a site visit? What is missing from this application, right? Our review panel was majority young people. And it was such an interesting process, and Victoria will speak about that more in depth, but some of the questions that were asked that really were critical and made us think, they didn't come from our adult partners. They came from the young people on that panel. And it's so instrumental in the decisions and who was funded, and which we'll talk about later when we talk about our success story. But I think the most important is that partnership piece. So I want to pass it over to Victoria.
So a little bit of background about me in this job position. So my name is Victoria Tuller-Cash. I filled the youth position with Youth on Their Own, originally called the Youth Engagement Coordinator, but since then I changed my title to Youth Engagement Specialist. So when my HDP funding is done in November, I will still be continuing to work at Youth on Their Own. And I have experienced housing instability majority of my life, mostly in foster care or couch surfing or doubling up. So this was a very fun and meaningful opportunity that I was able to take. I just wanted to read out the YHDP vision statement real quick, and it says, "We envision communities and systems throughout Tucson Pima County in which the causes of youth homelessness are disrupted and its solutions are permanent. This requires radical system changes built on intersectional equity and youth power. In these systems, young people drive individual housing solutions and hold equal power at all levels of community decision-making." And then right after that, there is the list of YHDP guiding principles that the Youth Action Committee specifically made in order to meet young people where they are at, to develop a shared understanding of what a young person needs to achieve full capacity and availability to make equal decision making. And each young person has their own unique experiences, strengths, and struggles that are needed to be addressed in order to fully succeed. So then in our next slide, all the colored boxes you see relate to the goals HUD is looking for in projects and communities to accomplish the steps we've taken or plan on taking. The first goal is coordinated community approach that promotes equity. And two of the main points in this goal that we've really been striving to do is developing shared definitions and transparency in order for everyone to understand what we're all talking about and all of us are on the same page, as well as capacity building, again, like meeting the young person where they are at and building upon that, so then we could have the most meaningful partnership and also having them set up for success. And skills to navigate the system and work with different agencies. So setting them up with skills that will help them successfully look for services, as well as successfully be able to work as a partnership with different adult agencies. And then our next goal is expanded capacity to develop innovative services and form non-traditional collaboration. And a big part of that is the paradigm shift from collaboration to partnership, which means doing a transition from tokenism to a transition of equal decision-making power between the youth as well as the adult partners we have. And to really hone in on this, we started identifying system challenges and interpersonal barriers, as well as enhanced cross-sector responses by forming two specific YHDP change teams. The first being YHDP Coordinated Entry Change Team, where we look for the different barriers that could be affecting young people when they go into coordinated entry, so they can receive services as soon as possible. And then with the YHDP Education Change Team, that is looking at barriers that intersect between education and homelessness. When you're homeless, there's a lot of things you can't do with education, like transportation. It's really hard finding transportation, as well as being able to pay for education related bills. Like whenever you want to graduate, graduation gowns cost so much money. Oh my goodness. As well as like figuring out how we can get like the education to how we can get the education to help us find housing, because a lot of time whenever you want to move up, it's very time consuming. Education is very time consuming outside of the regular trying to get your GED, trying to it be as many groups as possible. It's hard to keep up with all of that when you're trying to figure out where you're going to sleep next. And then the next goal at the end of this is center youth leadership and equitable decision-making, which is dismantling ableism and advancing equity. And by dismantling ableism, that goes back to the key target universalism. If we can really hone in on that, that will eventually positively affect everybody in the homelessness response system. So part of doing that is planning and implementation of different processes within our committees, as well as within working with our different YHDP grantees, which I'll talk more about in the next slide, as well as compensation for participation. There is TPCH members with lived and living experiences that always get paid $15 an hour. And again, they have the equal decision-making power in any committee that they are a part of. And there will always be, it says 4, but it's actually 5 permanent youth worker positions, that being the 3 outreach workers with Goodwill Metro, my position with Youth on Their Own, and the youth filled position with Zero. And then advocacy and leadership. We partnered with El Rio Reproductive Health Access Program to help with coordinating TA, as well as finding new members. A lot of people in El Rio really also have had experiences and started joining the YAC, which is amazing. And then again, the Youth Action Committee, we are a vital role in making all of these decisions. Again, we were part of the RFP review and a bunch of other decisions that will come up in the next slide. So this next slide is basically all that the Youth Action Committee has accomplished within YHDP. As you can notice, that's a lot we have accomplished. So there are key points I really want to talk about. First, review and approval of program participant guidelines. So the first step in that was the RFP review. We went through all of the applications and decided how much funding goes to which services that they applied for. And then right after that, once they were all approved, we then helped them out in going over their participant guidelines over around like October of 2020. And then another point in stable housing is the development and implementation of youth coordinated entry prioritization and referral process. We spent about a month going over different prioritization criteria, as well as the referral process, which really speaks to whenever a youth is 17 and a half, they're able to go into coordinated entry basically and be on a wait list. So then when they turn 18, either they don't have to wait, or that wait that they do have to experience is way shorter than if they did coordinated entry right as they turned 18. And by this policy being implemented by the Youth Action Committee, it eventually went to the entire sector outside of youth homelessness for people experiencing homelessness after incarceration or being in a medical facility. And then the development and implementation of youth case conferencing was a big thing that happened. And then we go over to permanent connections, which is review job descriptions and promote recommendations, which then goes into development and implementation of agency requests for YAC job interview process. So we first, helped out with forming a job description for these youth positions that accurately depicts what is this youth going to be doing in this job. And then right afterwards, when it was all ready and we were ready to interview people for these youth positions, the YAC was heavily involved in the hiring process. With each youth role, there was always at least one YAC member there to be a part of the hiring process. I was a part of the Zero job interviews. And that was a requirement we had for all of the YHDP grantees. And then the YAC just recently started going over continuous quality improvement. We started going over different measures that the grantees have written down over the past quarters or two. And then with education and employment, again, like a big part of education and employment goals was through the YHDP education change team. We were able to do multiple roundtables to figure out what exactly do youth want to address first and foremost. And we came up with a lot of ideas that we're going to start going over soon. And then also promotes like leadership opportunities, like advocacy trainings with Point Source Youth that the Youth Action Committee is actually doing this week, as well as partnering again with El Rio Reproductive Health Access Program. And then with health and well-being, really, you know, hold on. We've taken steps for wait, wrong slide. Sorry, I can't read the text on there. But like the main point in this section I really wanted to go over was really working with SAGA, which is basically Southern Arizona Gender Alliance, because there's a huge disparity with queer and trans folks that are dealing with homelessness, and we want to address that so then they're able to get the housing and services that they need. And then I'm going to give it over to Shannon.
Thank you. So it's important to remember as a community, the coordinated community plan that everybody agreed to and what we said that we were going to do so we can achieve those goals. TPCH committed to youth homelessness being brief, rare, and one time. As part of our governance structure, everything has to be approved by our YAC. So everything is approved by our YAC, which then goes to our Homeless Youth Coalition for a vote, which then goes to our larger COC board. So everything has youth voice, all that equal decision making is there. And even in these coalitions, Victoria and I have been the chair, vice chair of the Homeless Youth Coalition. So there's always a youth position there. So that's been really fantastic to have just kind of a wraparound voice in our community from youth and adult partners. Part of it is that equal decision-making continues from that planning stage to evaluation and now to system improvements. So it's been great to see like this years-long process, and we're now moving into that continuous quality improvement that's been discussed of how are these projects working. The youth is reviewing what those numbers are and saying, hey, is this working? Where can we make changes? What can we do now? This is kind of a balance of what our equal decision-making looks like. So that partnership didn't stop once that coordinated community plan was approved. We just keep on working on those system improvements. So we've had all that partnership and everybody's still devoting that time in our change teams, which are the coordinated entry change team, education change team, Homeless Youth Coalition, and the YAC. So that's been a continuing partnership. And I think that's been the largest piece of this, right? It's just that partnership. And then the adult providers of DCS, local government, the operations team, and this larger COC board, which does have youth at that table as well. So by having that equal decision-making between folks with lived experience of homelessness and housing instability and that cross-sector of providers, it's led to innovative solutions. And I think that this is really a testament to our community as a whole, that we all came together, youth, housing providers, justice involved adults, service providers specifically who cater to special populations came to the table and really worked hard. We had the HMIS lead. It was just amazing to see us all come together and work on all of those TA provided hours and hours of TA to get us to what our coordinated community plan was, what projects we were going to fund and the amounts. We had 8 local agencies that were funded with TA. There's a focus on racial equity, LGBTQIA inclusivity, and youth power. There are 78 year-round transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing beds that were brought online. And there's actually one specifically for LGBTQIA youth. Our housing and navigation services, this is our first go into supportive services only with our COC. So we have navigation and diversion and Goodwill, which we'll talk about in a little bit, doing some education and employment. So they're helping youth that may not have to enter the homeless system. They are trying to help with those who lived with fictive kin or natural supports to really support them, make sure they have their documents, make sure that they have money to continue to live there. Victoria talked a little bit about that our coordinated entry process has been revamped. We recentered on experiences of LGBTQIA, BIPOC, and non-citizen youth. What did they experience that's not maybe being beneficial to them in the current coordinated entry, and what can it look like? So we did spend a lot of time talking about that, coming up with prioritization pools, and that is then going into our bi-monthly, bi-weekly.
Oh, bi-monthly.
Our bi-monthly case conferencing. And so part of this is we also centered youth choice. What housing does youth actually want to live in? What supports do they actually need? Instead of just pushing, oh, this is the type of housing you got and this is the services you need. What do they actually want? So their voice is heard. And so youth and adults shared leadership across 3 TPCH committees and community coalitions, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, Homeless Youth Coalition, and the Youth Action Committee. So here are our YHDP providers. And again, Austin mentioned that as part of our TA, we came up with what types of projects does our community need? How much money would they need to really drive the biggest change? And in that, this is what we decided. You can go look at other YHDP communities. They look completely different from this. Everybody can choose their own, what they want to do with the funding, how much funding they want to allocate to that. And as I said, Goodwill Metro, our family services was 0, got supportive services only. And then there are the housings that show how many beds and how much money was allocated to each of those.
Thank you. That final project there at the end with Old Pueblo Community Services, the crisis transitional housing, that was, I feel like the theme of this forum has been innovative, right? And so this coordinated community plan was designed outside of a pandemic, right? And so we have been trying to shift and make sure that those core outcomes and the goals are still met. We have to be creative and innovative. Old Pueblo Community Services is delivering a crisis transitional housing program. It's site-based. It's dormitory style living for young folks when we think about that social connectedness and it's an LGBTQ affirming space. And we know that oftentimes LGBTQ folks are isolated, right? I think that percentage was like 47% of young folks were, like kicked out by their families. So that space is a city-owned property. And there were several presentations yesterday that talked about cities not relinquishing their land and repurposing it. And so that provider is able to, to have cost savings that go right directly back into serving people. And so that was a wonderful partnership. I think another thing that's important to discuss in the way that this funding structure, and I see my DCS friend back there, we were talking about the difference between outcomes and outputs. And in that, I think, from a service provider perspective, we see these applications and these funding releases come out, and we know that we do have to have outputs. That's how we, keep our doors open. But how do those outputs really correlate to the outcome, the experience of a young person? And as if any of y'all were in that Point Source Youth National Symposium with us, one of the most powerful things that remains with me as I will continue to do my work is that unsolicited, non-specific resources are useless, a young person said to us. And so, we come together as housing providers, and we really do want to end and prevent homelessness. We wouldn't be here. It's not glamorous. We don't make a ton of money. But how do we get there without inviting the folks that we want to support, and how we design that? And so in this structure, what you see is young people telling us what the specific meaningful resources are that will support them in overcoming and achieving stability. So we were asked if we could talk about a success story. And really, I think that our whole community is the success story. And if anyone in here from our community knows, I'm always crying, so bear with me. But I think it's not easy to shift the way you do things. Change is not easy for anyone. And to incorporate, and have the patience to teach someone, and then you layer on a pandemic, right? And so I think one of the greatest successes in our community is really that, is the community that was built out of it. Shannon's saying, like, all these different cross-sector providers. We have the Arizona Department of Education now that's on our board. She's coming to everything. Pima's doing great. And we have the Justice Department hosting forums, and young folks that are going to serve on other leadership panels across the health department and with Banner University, like all across our community. And so I think that is something that's very important. I think another really important piece, and it will directly relate right to our success story, is the way in which our leadership supports the goals of the projects that we're applying to, right? If HUD is asking us to center youth leadership, to center the experience of BIPOC and LGBTQ folks, but our senior leadership is not on the same page, it becomes very difficult. And so I feel very grateful, and some of that leadership is in this room today. But through this entire process, there's been conversations that have words like white silence and white dominance, and to be able to have a space to have authentic conversations where your leaders are listening and they're acknowledging and affirming that that is an experience of the people you are trying to serve and working with you to create solutions, then that is how you genuinely prevent and end homelessness. You cannot end homelessness for someone if you don't have someone who has been homeless there telling you what they need. So think of our success story. We have a COC newcomer. Goodwill of Southern Arizona has not received funding from our COC before. And if any of y'all receive funding from the COC, there's a lot of hoops and paperwork and stuff you gotta learn. And when I was a direct service provider, I used to tell my staff that there are resources and there are solutions, but there's just a bunch of burning hoops that folks have to jump through. And if we, as co-conspirators, can find out what's needed from the folks we're trying to serve to put the hoops out, then they're easier to get through. So Goodwill, there's a young person that came they're not from Tucson, and they're here in a pandemic, and they were actively homeless. And we put out some stuff to recruit for YAC, and they showed up, and they were showing up in parks and drop-in centers, but they were showing up. they were showing up with solutions, and they said, well, I don't know about that job position. I think you need to do this because, and this. Next thing you know, they're interviewing for that position and they're getting it. And they're entering in another program that we funded to get housed. So you have them stably housed and employed, and you have them participating in this experience that affords them leadership across their community. A month ago, that young person earned their GED. This is all over the past 15 months, y'all, right? And yesterday, after I left this forum, I went to do outreach, and that young person let me know that they have just finished applying for Pima, and is like leading another youth action type board in the community, and was asking for like tips. And so when we think of success, and we think about what really happens when you center the experience of the folks you're trying to support, then that's it, right? HUD asked us to bring young folks and ask them what they needed. We did that. HUD asks us, right, to elevate and make sure that there's employment opportunities for them, and the programs wrote for that to exist. And, you know, Kevin Costner, if you build it, they will come. But you can't build it without them. So I think they're doing some with you too, right?
Yeah, so this young person is also working with me on, and my other co-facilitators. I'm part of a Pima County LGBTQ Court Involved Youth Task Force, and we are working to set up a youth subcommittee of people who have actually been justice involved and been in dependencies to work together to drive what our task force can do for LGBTQ youth who have experienced these things. And they're really like driving those meetings on setting up our youth subcommittee. So it's been really great to work with them. The knowledge they've gained in just a few months is astounding. So it's been great to see that growth.
Let's see, what's next here? In the bottom here, it says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. I'm a James Baldwin lover, so. And there's some resources, right? And we provided this, so I think y'all will get the slides. But at the top there, if you click, you'll go to tpch.net/youth, and it'll let you know all about the things that we talked about. There's also a pretty great video that our young folks developed. And I think that's it. Those are all our agencies, and in the PowerPoints that they'll share, if you click them, it'll take you straight to their website. All right, I think you wanted us to leave significant time for questions.
Thank you. What an amazing program you have put together. I have a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. But my first question is, this is such a great collaboration, and it was such a complicated grant application. I know that because I've looked at it. Who drove that? Who was the driver of this project?
So the our continuum was awarded a planning grant, and so the city of Tucson is the recipient of that, and our sub-recipients are co-conspirators, Youth on Their Own. That's from a perspective of like they see the other part of young people that our housing services don't. Our family services, they're like our housing provider premier, right, for young folks, and Zero coming in with that experience of like BIPOC and actual like data research and looking at that. But our family services in the planning process contracted, you know, a great person to support in like leading the community in that discussion. But really the drivers of that were all of those folks. It's truly collaborative. And I think that really speaks to like maybe like the first couple times our community not getting it, but really sinking our teeth into that collaboration and making it meaningful, and knowing that it's not gonna, we're not gonna have a panel of young folks and tokenize their experience. Like they've got to be brought in. So it was all of us driving it, which is challenging. It's a lot of person.
Time consuming and challenging, yes. Who did your needs assessment? Because I was very impressive with the very detailed, and how do you find the youth to survey? Yeah, that's difficult.
It was LaCroix and Milligan did our needs assessment. And I know there was about 150 youth surveyed in that. And I think that there was an incentive and they just went to one place that are a couple places that you normally go and did that incentive, did that survey. And yeah, there was about 150.
And I think that young people knowing that their input is going to be utilized. I think any person, I don't know about you, I don't want someone to ask me something and not use it, you know? And so those young folks that participated in that survey, a lot of them continued on through that process until they aged out. Some of them served on our panel for reviewing. So the way in which you ask folks when you're doing a needs assessment and you're transparent, as Victoria mentioned, about what you're going to do with that needs assessment and then being accountable to it.
About how many youth are you serving right now? Do you know in this program?
The last time I saw some numbers, it was from like who had been referred through our system, and that was in late April, and it was 195 young people or something through our HMIS system. We launched in October of 2020.
That was a lot of planning then. You started in 2017?
Yeah, they
Yeah.
kept trying. Yeah.
And launched in 2020.
Yeah.
That's amazing, like sticking to it, sticking with it to make it happen. Thank you. One of the things we've noticed over the 2 days of talking about homelessness is language. And a lot of speakers are talking about language. And we heard about, changing affordable housing to housing affordability. And that sounds better, or instead of a shelter, a center for displaced persons. What language, Barry, because you mentioned that, Victoria, that you had to figure out transparency in the language that you're speaking with the youth to bring them in. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So what I found was we oftentimes were quite frank about what is happening. I feel like in Tucson and Pima County, we don't find it useful to dance around kind of like the problems that are happening and what young people are facing. In affordable housing, just that term alone, it should just be normal. It shouldn't have negative connotations that will turn possible funders away or create newbieism in our community. And then again, like I feel like kind of being very blunt and frank has really kind of contributed to our transparency. Again, because if we keep on dancing around these words, it's not going to get us anywhere.
Thank you. And the other thing we've also heard that helps make these kinds of services successful is the peer support, the peers being caseworkers and having the lived experience and working. And you mentioned that quite a few times, but I think that you have taken that to the next level with not just having the caseworkers be peers and lived experience, but also having the youth involved in every decision. That is like next level. So it's so cool.
Yeah. And the way that rolls into the rest of your community, right? Like our young people will become adults. And so Goodwill had their peer outreach team has started to integrate with our Continuum's adult outreach team. And they're sharing ideas and teaching our adult outreach team things that they didn't know and new strategies and techniques.
And the last thing I'm going to say is that I wrote down when you said burning hoops to go through, we always talk about all the hoops you have to go through, but I've never heard anybody say burning hoops. And that just stuck with me because
It's true.
Hard
They're
applications,
on
yes.
fire, but there are resources at the end of them. When they're on fire, you can't see it because the fire and the smoke, but if you put them out, and then you can just kind of help someone walk through the hoops. So, but really we have to destroy them. I don't know who's in here that designed these hoops, but if you're listening.
I feel like we always blame the next level of government,
Who
it's
did
the
it?
federal hoop,
Who
and
did
it's this hoop, yeah. But
No,
we
some of
all,
those
every
hoops
level.
are our own, right?
Yeah.
And so like our coordinated entry change team that is it. And Victoria talked about our minor transfer policy. And that was, right, that's a burning hoop. We knew minors, right, they're served in a system and they are experiencing homelessness. And then they're gonna turn 18 and it's not gonna count, right? And why? Because we haven't figured out how to put that hoop out. And in that, as Victoria said, that minor transfer policy really said, well, how are we transferring anyone in our system as their needs change? And so there it grows.
Wonderful, thank you. Open it up for questions from the audience. If you have a question, could you come up to the microphone and ask your question, please? Thank you.
First, wonderful presentation. Thank you guys so much for your work. It's amazing. I'm hoping its model is being reproduced across the country because I think it's an amazing way to engage. I have a couple of questions. One is about metrics. I know the program's fairly young in its implementation, and you mentioned 200 youths being served. I'm curious if you have an idea of the magnitude of how many youth are out there that need assistance. And then maybe the success of, of the 200 youth that you're serving, how many are able to kind of launch from the platform you're providing for them? So I guess I have a third question. The other one would be, I think financial literacy is so often not taught even in schools very well to kids. And I was wondering if that's a vital part of your program too. Thank you again.
For that question. All right, so I'm gonna make sure I have them all. When we began developing our by name list, that was like right at the start of pandemic. And so I hear that probably has grown. And so the numbers are kind of off, but it was a little over 350 or something, like deduplicated young folks. We know that that list is only as effective as our outreach can be. So there's probably more young folks that we do not reach. As far as like, what does that mean for their jumping off point when we think about supportive services and like meaningful access to stuff that folks need? We were funded for diversion, and in that they have like, a flexible pool to support folks in their stability, but also really intentional about, and this is where our youth on the review panel were really instrumental, but intentional about awarding agencies that they serve particular populations. So if folks had different needs. So, and I see some of them back there. But, we have folks that their agencies have, specialized, have more focused resources for behavioral health and mental health support. And so those folks are funded. And we have agencies that work exclusively with like young people and families so that we make sure that pregnant parenting youth are supported. We have, and I see them right there, our crisis transitional facility has a history of supporting folks as they are like re-entering our community. And so how are they able to support and that shared skill building, right? We're intentional about the folks that we have selected to deliver these programs. And we know that it's going to have an ongoing expectation of partnership and collaboration. And we all get to learn from each other. Because I don't know about y'all, but when I served folks, they came into everybody's door. And so how do we know what each other is doing and leverage our unique experience? And then the final part, the financial literacy part, and Victoria can speak to what Youth on Their Own offers, but Youth on Their Own, which supports young folks that are in education and disconnected from housing, has all sorts of resources for folks that support financial literacy, and all of our Youth Action Committee members are able to receive those services from Youth on Their Own without being enrolled in other education projects. And our Goodwill providers, they have all sorts of resources for financial literacy, and their other complementary funding provides that access to support young folks in that stability.
Another thing to add is YAC as well as the RSG BCH, we're working now for a youth-friendly page to develop online tutorials or lessons on certain things like how to apply for a rental or how to budget. And that's been a really fun process, and we're still working a lot on that.
I'll also add that as part of the Education Change Team roundtables, Ciro and Goodwill are working on a tax, like a very basic tax class of that will help youth and what they actually need to learn about how to file taxes, so on and all that whole thing. So we're working on that separately as well. So the Education Change Team those roundtables have been very informative. And we've had so many collaborators attend those. So that has really driven some of that extra work that you're asking about.
Really good question, financial management for everyone. I don't think we teach it enough in school either, and that credit history affects you for the rest of your life. So you don't want to ruin it when you're young. Any other questions? Anna, any questions from virtual? No? Thank you.
I have a question. So as a Tucsonan, right, I've had the opportunity to watch from the sidelines some of the amazing work that's happening with the Homelessness Demonstration Project. And one of the things that struck me is that these concepts that HUD and communities are recognizing as core youth values are really just core human values. And like how we work. And so I'm curious, when you think about the work that's been done through this initiative and some of these strategies that are being used currently only with young people, for those of us who may not be youth providers or may be serving populations other than just youth, I'm curious if you could tell us a little about what are the lessons learned or the things as whole systems, and we think about how we're working with unhoused people, some of those strategies that we should be looking at system-wide for all folks.
So I feel like our experience of kind of looking at the intersectionalities that youth have, experienced that kind of affect our housing is, a lot of us youth are either queer or trans or BIPOC, or have experienced different types of housing instability before we turned 18. And just looking at all of those different sectionalities doesn't just apply for youth, that applies for everybody. Even after you turn 24, you're considered like an adult in the housing system.
I think that it's brought kind of like a renewed energy to our community. I don't want to keep calling out Old Pueblo, but I see Tom right there. But they didn't have a youth program before, and now they do. And that focus on when we were going out there and really talking to the community about this project before that funding came, we were talking about the experiences of LGBTQ youth and BIPOC youth, and people in our community were floored by 40% of homeless youth are LGBTQ. And that just kind of was like, what? It's very jarring and very like, we need to do something about this, like giving us that renewed energy, and all that collaboration kind of like boosted that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question, Mr. Thorpe. So I came to the city, and I actually had never directly served young people before in housing. I had like a different life where I helped them with healthcare and that kind of stuff. But try to find an eloquent way to say this. Right. The folks that we're serving, they are young, but they're adults. They're 18 to 24-year-old adults in our community. And like lessons learned when you're working with anyone who is actively experiencing someone, how do we slow down? How do we adapt, right? To the needs of the folks that we're working with. And that was a big lesson learned. I think that goes straight back to Miss Mosley out there when we were talking about outcomes and outputs. And so, we're all a bunch of service providers trying to write project applications, and we want to achieve those metrics and make sure that we get 85% of young people connected to employment, yada, yada. But the big lesson learned there is like to really just slow down. And I think that when we, in particular, when I think of our RFP process, we're thinking there are going to be all these projects, right? And they are lengthy pages and they have really explicit details. And so we were thinking on a side of how do we prepare young people that may have never read a project, right? It's interesting. We did all this work to set it up, and it seemed to be most useful for our adult partners that had served on our panels before. So it makes you think like, well, what were they grading before? But I think that was a big lesson learned when adultism, right? That was a big lesson learned in the way that, like I'm wiser, I'm older, I've been through certain things, and that's not necessarily true. And the way that you even, it's almost like learned, right? And so in our partnership, when agree to disagree, right, between youth and adult, our adult partners didn't really appreciate some of the ways that they received critical feedback, although it's definitely ways that we often as adult providers give critical feedback. And so like stopping and just being a transparent and authentic and having like restorative conversations to move past so that you're still going to be working together. That was a big lesson.
I just have one more thing to add. I remember specifically when the Youth Action Committee was going over standards for our CQI measures. When we were trying to figure out these different percentages, Jason Thorpe was there to help us out. And at one point he said, everyone deserves to be housed, no ifs, ands, or buts. If it was my decision, all this would be zero, but I guess we have to be realistic. And ever since that, it really kind of made me think more of just like, okay, I need to check whatever internalized adultism or whatever internalized homophobia towards myself or transphobia or just anything deemed some people could deem as aggressive or bad behavior when really it's trying to be, trying to self-advocate for yourself, but you're getting tired. So that's really stuck with me ever since.
Any other questions? Yes.
So thank you for the amazing work you're doing. I'm so late this morning for certain reasons, but I have a question, but maybe it's already been asked. So you can just say it's already been asked and go sit down. I'm curious if this model was just so of implementation, whatever we want to call it, of involving the persons who are experiencing the problem we're trying to be helpful on. Do you see that expanding? I mean, this was kind of, usually these things are kind of driven by some initiative from HUD that says you shall do these things, or SAMHSA or someone else. As an agency, I know at OPCS, we really want to get to that point where this is how we normally do things. That if we're going to do something for veterans, that currently homeless veterans are involved in the discussion, or if we're going to do something for someone else, they're involved in that discussion. And it's harder and it takes more work, but it's so much better. So I just don't know if that's something that has been talked about in that kind of making it a blueprint for how we do work in Tucson.
So when HUD released YHDP, part of the demonstration is to like look at what works best across the nation to develop like new frameworks and models for best practices. But I don't know, many of y'all have read the NOFO that dropped 2 days ago, but I think that it most explicitly calls out how do communities work with BIPOC folks, like what are you doing to center that? What are you doing to really elevate folks with lived experience and bring them to those decision-making tables? So I I believe across our nation, there is a general shift of how do we make sure that the folks we're trying to support in any human service are there across the different sectors of, councils that I participate on. All of those folks are beginning to talk about that. And so Tucson, like as a community in this project, has already been participating and leading that across the nation. We're around 3 community. There's 15 communities awarded in this demonstration. And over the past 18 months, in Baltimore, Anchorage, Hennepin, like across the nation, folks have reached out. They've wanted to know how your program was set up and how y'all came to a lease agreement with the city. I see CPSA sitting back there. They are permanent supportive housing. It's not very often that you see young folks that have permanent supportive housing. So communities wanted to know the framework for that. And our youth case conferencing across the nation, folks aren't necessarily doing that, right? In Pima County, we are doing veteran case conferencing, and but we hadn't talked about young people. And so, that's also, we're shifting out of a BI SPDAT usage. You're gonna design something that prioritizes folks in your system, probably wanna have them there. So I do believe that this will be an ongoing shift. My position asked for someone with lived experience, they can't require it. I moved here as a homeless young person at 9 years old. I ran away at 17. I was that transition age youth that needed your program. And so to now be here doing that, right? So that is growing and ongoing.
I'll add that I think that a lot of the, YHDP leadership and those who have received funding are on other boards and panels in our community, and they're bringing it up in those places. So it is ever expanding because, I'm forcing it on my LGBTQ court involved task force personally, and so I think that it's something that is, as our community, changing because of all of the work that we're doing.
And then I want to add recently, the Equitable Housing Commission recently had decided to have a dedicated seat for homeless youth lived experience, which has been amazing. And also just the fact that, Austin, Shannon, and I are able to speak here today, it just shows that we're being recognized in a state and nationwide level. And it's we're definitely not going to slow down or go away anytime soon.
Thank you. Any other questions? No questions? Well, I want to thank you for coming today and telling us about this fantastic program. You're doing wonderful work, and thank you so much.